reach any age, your birthday is a time where you sit together with friends and grab a drink and wonder, who the hell am I? And so I think this is a really good time, opportune moment to sit back and kind of think about, who is Mississippi? Who are we? What does that mean? What does it mean to be a Mississippian? There are a lot of different ways we can pull this apart, and I know that all of our panels will have different ways of approaching this question. I deal a lot with politics and policy, and so that's sort of my natural entree into any question like this. And we're, of course, on the heels of an election in Mississippi in which we hear a lot about who's the average Mississippi voter. You know, how do we reach the average voter? What does that average voter want? And we know, because we watched the ads and we sat through it, that, you know, the average voter is probably somebody that cares about how big their candidate's truck is, and, you know, how much they hunt and how often they go to church and all of that. We really see sort of who we think of as being representative of our state, based on, you know, how candidates present themselves. We're going to be moving from campaigning to governing pretty soon, and so it transitions from the average voter to who's the average constituent. You know, so when we're crafting legislation, you know, we can show everybody here on the stage comes prepared with lots of data, but we know that often what carries the day is sort of who's that archetype that our legislators are thinking about. Who's that person back home in their district that they think is representative? And that's going to determine how they vote on a piece of legislation. Businesses think about, who's our average customer in this area? Who's who's a representative of our labor pool here? Journalists think about, like, who's the average person on the street that we can go and get, we can go talk to and get a pulse, feel their pulse. And so even though we know that in a state with 2.986 million people, even though that's a small state, it's a very fraught thing to try to figure out who is average. How can one person or one sort of identity group be representative of all of those people? And yet we do it in so many different areas of life and of public life, and it ends up having quite a big impact on the type of state that we live in. And so that's why I think it's a really good topic to discuss, and luckily we have three brilliant people here to discuss it, myself not included in that group. I will probably not introduce you as well as you can introduce yourself, but we have first with us Tracy DeVries of the Women's Foundation, and Ercilla Dometz, from the State Economist Office and the University Research Center, and then John Green at the end from the Center for Population Studies at the University of Mississippi. To get this started, I think that first I'd ask you to maybe give a little bit better introduction of yourself and what you do and how you sort of approach this work. But how do you think about who is Mississippi, and who do you think of as being sort of average, and what are some ways that maybe, what are some misconceptions about that you encounter?
Can y'all hear me? All right, hi, I'm Tracy DeVries. I'm the Executive Director of the Women's Foundation of Mississippi, and I'm a transplant to Mississippi. I moved here 3 years ago, and so I am doing the opposite of the brain drain that often gets discussed during these sessions. People ask me this question all the time. Well, there are two questions, and then they have like sub-questions. Why did you move here, and what do you think? The why did I move here is a little bit easier. I got married, my husband was here, he had kids who were here, and so the decision we made was that I would move here. The what do you think? There's apparently no right answer for this question, because usually I say things like, well, there's a lot less traffic, and I really love that, except for this evening, there was a ton on my way here, so that didn't work out for me. I often talk about how friendly people are here. So one of the things that would happen, I would come here to visit, and I'd be here for 2 weeks before my husband and I got married. I would come and I would visit, and I would walk down the street, and people would just sort of wave at me from their cars or say hi. And I just thought, why are those people talking to me? Because in Washington, D.C., where I come from, we don't do that. We get on the metro and we don't make eye contact. We get as small as we can. We try to not touch each other if it's at all possible. We definitely don't say hi. So there are a lot of differences that are like that you may not even realize. So I come to Mississippi and to the work of the Women's Foundation from a different perspective than somebody who grew up here and lived here. And having said that, I would also say that for our organization, we invest in projects and programs across the state that are focused on economic security for women. We invest in things like degree and skills programs that get women to sort of that next level, to be able to get that next level of job, because women in Mississippi are living in poverty. Children living in poverty in Mississippi 75% of them are in a household that's headed by a woman, whether that's a single mom or a mom that's actually the major breadwinner in the family. And people are always surprised by that. They're always thinking that this is some single mom thing. They think it's some whatever, and that's not actually the case. So we always look at things from those lenses and what is the work that we can do in those spaces. We also fund programs that are focused on decreasing the rates of the high STI rates for teens in Mississippi, the high rates of pregnancy for teens in Mississippi, and other opportunities for women to access the care that they need. And we also focus on two-generation work. And I probably left your question at this point because now I'm talking about my organization. So I'm going to stop.
It was in there somewhere.
It was in there, but I got off.
Okay. Good evening, everyone.
Hello.
Okay. My name is Ercilla Dometz-Hendrix, and I am a policy analyst in the Office of the State Economist. I'm not an economist, and I'm the touchy-feely one of, let me see, 1, 2, 3, in between 4 economists. I'm the one who says, why don't we look at, the human perspective as opposed to data? Eventually they win because data never lies, and we know that. But I am also a transplant here. I grew up in a little village called Perla, Nicaragua, that's in Central America, and I came here 13 years ago to grad school at Jackson State University, and then I met my husband there, and I failed to convince him to come back to Nicaragua with me, and so I'm here now. And I'm a Jacksonian by conviction, I tell people, because eventually, I chose to stay, or he chose for us. Just to answer the question of, what does the average Mississippian look like at the Office of the State Economist and the University Research Center, what we try to do is we try to find solutions to make Mississippi a better place. And in that search, we have found that Mississippians rather not look like a certain person, but they want a certain thing. So Mississippians, we found out, I'm going to approach it from this perspective, if you don't mind. One, affordable health care. Mississippians want sidewalks. Mississippians want just to be able to make a living, a decent living. They want jobs. And so I think that right now is what a Mississippian looks like in data. But also, just in being here every day, you find that what the average Mississippian wants also is for the rest of the United States. I dare say the rest of the world, because, parenthesis, when I told my cousins that I live in Jackson, Mississippi, I was like, why Jackson, Mississippi? And they're back in Nicaragua, so there's some stigma across the border as well. And so, you want to be known for the state of hope. Despite all the things that happen here historically, you want to be different than your past, and I think that that's something that we can share collectively now. So.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm John Green. As was mentioned, I'm with the Center for Population Studies at the University of Mississippi and serve as a professor of sociology and director of the center. And we were joking before the start of the talk that the stage makes you feel like your inner comedian might be coming out. I'm a demographer, and so I don't have any super funny jokes. I'm going to give you my best demography joke that I stole from one of my mentors in the center. Do you know why demographers are always depressed? Because we all know how it ends. Yeah, there we go. All right. That shouldn't be funny, right? So our center, we house the State Data Center for Mississippi, which is a collaborative partnership between the state of Mississippi and the U.S. Census Bureau. We work on all kinds of different projects, really trying to connect the utilization of data about populations with community development, economic development, and then also health. And as we were plugging the census, that's a big part of our role, is helping data users to make use of census data, and not just the decennial census, but a wide variety of different data products. We also do original research. We do a lot of work with health. We do a lot of field-based work, but really the focus is in thinking about how do we use data to understand ourselves and our communities, and then also what we want in our communities and how to get there. How can we use research and data to help inform that? Thinking about the question that Jake posed is really great, and today being Statehood Day, I had looked at some of our census information. It's kind of interesting, that we were established as a state on December 10th in 1817. Actually, census data had been collected in the state of Mississippi in 1800 as kind of forbearance of understanding what might be happening. But it wasn't until the census of 1820 that Mississippians were counted as a part of a state. And if you think about all the changes that have taken place since then, in terms of some of the challenges that we face as a people, in terms of slavery, in terms of the relationship with Native Americans, you think about all these different things that divide us in terms of who's counted, who votes, who has power and authority in terms of governing. There have been an immense amount of changes since that time. But also just in terms of the characteristics of the people. In 1870, the first census after the Civil War, the count was just over 825,000 people, about 827,000 people. But we were a different state in terms of our territory, in terms of who was counted, and so forth. So a lot of times historians and demographers point to 1890 as really the time in which we have some comparative counts. But interestingly, there was a major fire in the 20s that destroyed most of those records. So we have limited knowledge since then. But nonetheless, if you think about in 1890, we were at about 1.3 million people, and as Jake mentioned, we're now at about 2.9, close to 3 million people. And you think about the characteristics. What is the average Mississippian? I think my response is that doesn't exist. But there's no such thing as the average Mississippian. And I think as a state, if we could embrace that and embrace the fact of how diverse we are in terms of our racial and ethnic characteristics, we think about our regional differences, whether you're in places like Jackson, or you're on the coast, or you're in the hills, or the Delta, where I do most of my work. If you're in the piney woods, community, the ways in which people engage, and the characteristics of those people, there's a lot of difference. And to me, I think that's really the power, that if we were to embrace that and celebrate it and acknowledge it, that would be really valuable. And I just want to build on the previous comment that even when we account for all of that diversity, there's some common interests and some common concerns that I think we all do embrace. We might have different ideological perspectives, different religious orientations, and so forth. But when you think about what maybe unites us, are some of these common things around what we want. And really, the divide is, how do we get there? Is the question. And from the work that I do, I think at least part of that is, how do we inform the conversation through data that reflects ourselves.
John, if I could stay with you, since you and the center are entrusted with coming up with the population estimates for the state of Mississippi, and being that key census partner, could you go through some sort of top line statistics about Mississippi, so we just have an idea of sort of population, maybe where people live, sort of rural versus urban settings, racial demographics, gender?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So as we mentioned, we're just under about 3 million people, one of the things that's really interesting and connected to the point earlier about the Humanities Council's Crossroads program with the Smithsonian exhibit is that there are different ways in which we define our geographic areas and the populations within them. One of which is kind of the rural-urban or metro, non-metro designations. And later, if you're interested, we can go into the details of that. But however we measure what is constituted as rural or what's constituted as non-metro, over half of Mississippians live in what we would consider rural places. And I think that's certainly a central element that we need to think about is we can define that demographically and geographically, but what does it mean in terms of identity? What does it mean in terms of the characteristics of our communities? How does that relate to what our aspirations might be? We have wide variation in terms of the areas of growth and the areas of population loss. And oftentimes we look at the state as a whole, and this is certainly important, to say how many people are we losing to migration, how many people are we gaining to migration, what's our fertility rate, what's our mortality rate, and trying to look at that in terms of what's the prospects for either maintaining a certain population or growth. But of course we want to zero in on that issue of out-migration. Now, as a demographer, I think it's really important to emphasize net migration, right? It's not that any community that's inherently a great idea to never have people leave your community and experience new things and new opportunities, but at the same time we want to attract people, right? And so that balance, what we consider net migration, between people leaving and people coming in is really what's central. And as a state, we do estimate that we're losing. The Census Bureau does the official population estimates for all the states, but all the states participate in providing data and working with all the different state agencies and data providers to help inform that. And we think that, for example, from since 2010, that there's been about a 14 to 15% migration rate that's been a loss, out migration. And so one way you can think about that is for about every 1,000 people that we had in 2010, that we've lost about 15 people per 1,000. So that's a concern. We're one of the top in the country. But interestingly, in terms of international in-migration, we're positive. We have more international in-migrants than out-migrants. This is important when we think about that balance, about the characteristics of the people of Mississippi. Is that on one side, we're losing population domestically, people from Mississippi moving to other states, especially Tennessee, if you're curious about that. But on the flip side, we are attractive internationally, and I think these are some parts of our identity that are important to take into account. Also, when we think about that level of what's happening in terms of net migration, that it's one thing to look at it for the state, as I mentioned, but when we look at it by county, for example, or look at it by region, there's wildly different stories, in terms of where people are coming and also where they're leaving. So, for example, in North Mississippi, Lafayette County is the fastest growing overall population, percentage-wise, the fastest growing county, actually in the state now, percentage-wise. And Quitman County, just one county away, we're only separated by Panola County, where Batesville is the fastest population decrease county in the whole state. So, that level of variation, I think, is an important part to the story. Is how can we understand that and what can we do to help communities survive and thrive in that context? And again, we can get to this with later comments, but one thing I want to point out is that when we look at the reasons that people move, we don't have great data on this just for specific states, but when we look nationally, it's only about 1/5 of the reason that people report moving being specifically job-related. It's only about 1/5. And I think that's important because we know we do face all kinds of economic challenges that we want to try to overcome as a state and within our communities. But there's a lot of space and a lot of opportunity for us to take on what are those other things in our community that make a difference.
Yeah, Ercilla, I think that's actually a really good place to maybe hand it to you because you, as you mentioned, you are the non-economist in the state economist office. How do you think about sort of adding that human element to some of these broader economic and policy research questions? And, and so how do you think about making this a place where, where one, we can try to keep people here, attract people here, but also how can we make it a better place to live for the people that are already here? How do you think about that?
Well, I think about it, many, many years ago, I read this story in, Reader's Digest. I'm telling my age. But I don't know how I found it. No, I'm lying. The book was mine. I love it. There it is. So anyway. And it was a story about, there was a kid who was mowing lawns, and he had different clients on his street, and his dad overheard him on the phone asking a question to the lady next door and saying, hey, I'm looking for new clients. Do you need me? Do you need someone to mow your lawn? And so the lady was like, no, I don't. I have someone right now. And so when he hung up the phone, his father said, I thought you mowed her lawn. And he's like, I do, but I just wanted to know how I'm doing. And I think that just to me is kind of like the answer to Mississippi's, what ails Mississippi, and how can we get people to come to the state, and how can we get people to stay? Find out how we're doing. Just simply ask the question. Kind of like an exit interview. Why are you leaving? I think we kind of know people leave because they have better job opportunities, and we know that you're coming to the state because right now I'm low on the totem pole because you found a job here, or a lot of people move back because of family come back and take care of a parent or family member, and so I think kind of finding out what could help bring people back to the state is number one, but also to deal with the issues that make people leave. For example, education. The people migrate because There's a better, we migrate in-state because there's a better public school in the other county. You know, we keep going until we find a better job and a better public school in another state. You know, and I think that's something that we really have to take a look at. Educational attainment in Mississippi is low. You know, that's one of our problems. It's one of the problems with our low workforce participation. You know, the educational attainment. So I think that we have to look at it, we have to take a hard look, and also just to make, we talked about brain drain, but to make it a priority, you know, because we can sit here, Humanities Council, and talk about it. We can have conferences, you know, after the election, and we need to deal with the issue of brain drain. We need to recognize that it's a problem. You talked about polling and how polling determines what ways campaigns go. You know, if we dealt with Mississippi, you know, like how we dealt with polling and campaigns, I think we'd be better off today. I don't know, did I answer your question? Or just, once you put the microphone in front of folks, you just kind of get creative. Yeah.
Tracy, I know something that you know you and the Women's Foundation work on quite a bit is making sure that more women are represented in the halls of power and are given decision-making power in this state. As I was looking through some of the census figures this afternoon, women actually make up the majority of Mississippians. It's 51.4% of the state are women. But I'm not sure how it changed in this most recent legislative elections, but Mississippi was in the last legislative term at the bottom or near the bottom in women's representation in the legislature. And it just has historically not had women who really ascended to high office in the state. Can you talk a little bit about how if you have any sort of general sort of takeaways having come to Mississippi, if you think that there are any reasons why women are, you know, sort of less represented in politics here, based compared to where you've been before, but also, you know, what are some ways that we can help people be better represented in sort of in who Mississippi is and the data? How can we make sure that they're better represented in participation in politics?
That's very, that's big.
Sorry, that was a big question. Take it any way you
It's
want.
big. So I think the recent election, I think we basically netted out at about the same percentage. I want to say we were maybe closer to 16% than we were before, when we were at like 14.9, and now it's at 15.2 or something like that. I don't know. But when you look at who's in our state legislature, it is still heavily white male, period. And that, I think, is a challenge because that doesn't represent the state for anyone, well, except for other white men, obviously, but it does not, it's not representative. And so if you want to see change, we have to have people who look like the rest of us in office, right? I mean, that's how that ends up working. So, you know, for me, I obviously want to see more women in office. I want to see more black women in office. I want to see more white women coming out and voting for black women. I want to see all of those things happen. And, you know, we as women, I think, have to stand together more than we do sometimes, and hold each other up and vote for each other. What were your other questions?
Well, so this is one on mine. I didn't actually ask you the question, but I'm curious what ways that you've seen play out in sort of practical terms for women being underrepresented in the legislature, but being a majority of the population. What are the sort of policy outcomes of that?
Yeah. So one of the things that I've been looking at recently is there are maternity care deserts in our state. I want to say it's 45 or 50 counties in our state have actual maternity care deserts. And so what that means is if you're pregnant and you're going to have a baby, you don't have a place to go to visit your doctor. Just think about that, whether you're a man or a woman. If you're in a relationship with someone who is pregnant, if you're the person who's pregnant and you cannot get care, think about what that means and what that might be like. So for me, in terms of policy, and I know this is going to be controversial, but I'm going to say it anyway. Medicaid expansion. We are losing a lot of money. We are losing a lot of money every year that can pay for healthcare, that can pay for a lot of different kinds of healthcare, and we are losing that money every year because we keep on saying no to Medicaid expansion. To me, that's a really big issue, and I don't even think that shouldn't even be about politics. I mean, the way this works is this. We all pay taxes. And then money comes back and pays for stuff. And so if we say, no, we don't want that, we're out. That's how that works. And so if you like who's in office and you don't like who's in office and all of those things, gosh, like let's deal with that out here, okay? Like let's argue about that stuff out there. But let's get some health care for all of the things that all of us need. The second thing that I think women care about a lot and ought to care about is equal pay. So, here we've got the gender wage gap. So the numbers, depending on where you are in the U.S., are kind of like 75 to 80%. So women make about 75 to 80% of what men make. It depends on where you are. It goes up or down a little bit. In Mississippi, it's 75%. The other thing, though, is that when you're looking at women of color, that number drops closer to 50%. Black women make slightly more than Hispanic women do, but those numbers drop to 50%.
That's not right.
That's right. So, when you look back at the number of children who are living in poverty and they're living in a household that's headed by a woman, 75%. 75% of children who are living in poverty in Mississippi are living in a household that's headed by a woman somehow, whether she's a single mom or she's the main breadwinner in the family. If we were to actually just close that wage gap, just close the wage gap between men and women in similar occupations, close it, we would cut poverty in Mississippi in half. That would take care of that, half. It wouldn't take care of everything, but think about that. It's astounding. It's absolutely astounding. We are the last state in the country to pass equal pay legislation. Alabama just did it last year. And while I realize that I'm a transplant, nothing makes me more upset than when Alabama beats us at anything. Nothing. So in terms of policy, I think those are things that are really important. And those are things that are important to women, but they're also things that are important to all of us. They're things that should be important to our families, and they're things that should be important to our kids. And none of this is about taking away. None of we get into these things where it's like, well, you have to take from here and give to there. That's not it. It's let's get us all to a place where we can have decent health care and our kids can go to schools and get educations and do all of those things. I read recently, and I say this all the time, in any group, if you have at least 33% of the people within that group like-minded or on a similar path or interested in the same thing, that's when you start to see change happen. So when you get to that magic 33 number, when you see 33% of women are part of the legislature, 33% of women are part of a C-suite in a corporation, 33% of or whatever, and whether we're talking about women or maybe talking about any number, that's when you start to see change. And so for me, I'm always looking at how can we get to this place where women have enough influence to be at that 33% number so that we can get to that next level.
So I have a question based on, sparked by a tweet that I read earlier from our governor-elect, Tate Reeves. Hold your applause. Stuart's Winston back there. But he wrote a tweet in honor of Statehood Day and said, over the past 202 years, Mississippi has experienced many triumphs and hardships, from setting the stage as the birthplace of America's music to recovering from Hurricane Katrina. Through it all, Mississippians have done what Mississippians do and held on to our small town way of life. We're here sitting in the heart of Jackson. I think that what he is expressing there is kind of, when I think about going back to that original question about what do we think of when we think of the average Mississippian, Mississippi's identity, I think, really is bound up in being rural or in small communities. And it plays out in expressions like that. It plays out, if you look at any Mississippi tourism ad, none of them highlight Jackson. They highlight the Delta and small towns, and you get lots of pastoral, shots and sort of flying over Cottonland and all of that. And I think that is something that actually it matters to how we think of ourselves as a state. It certainly matters in relation to the population trends that we're seeing in this state and everywhere else in the country, and in some respects all over the globe, where people are moving to urban areas, and you have an outmigration from rural areas and small towns, and you have a loss of the traditional economic bases in those places, and that the factors of production are sort of moving to cities where people are getting together and sharing ideas rather than working in agriculture where you need lots of land and people spread out, or whether you're working in a factory where you have to all be there in the same shop. And so, when Governor Reeves says that, that what we've done throughout is hold on to our small town way of life, I hear that and say, well, we're just going to be even more obsolete as a state in 10, 20 years when, we're already 50th, and this is actually putting us behind the curve and positioning us poorly to be able to grow and retain and attract people, but also to have any sort of economic reason for being in this state. And so I'd like to kind of just throw that out as a general comment that y'all can chime in on. But first is how just the geography of the state and the size of our cities or lack thereof does play into our identity, whether there's something real and valuable to that. But where you see that, if you can project moving forward, how is that gonna, when we sit and celebrate the 210th birthday or the 220th birthday of the state, what is it gonna look like?
Well, I'll certainly jump in there. I mean, I think, one of the challenges, and I do have to say that I'm somewhat biased in this response. I'm a rural sociologist by training, and so make my most of my living focused on rural and small town places. But I think the question is really critical, because oftentimes the way in which we think about rural is whatever's not urban. And if we flip that on its head, it's still equally problematic, right? Whatever's urban is what's not rural. So, we try to address this in terms of from data and policy perspective and, rural development and urban development initiatives, through different ways of defining and measuring these places. But there's something about the character of the places that those data have a hard time capturing. And I think that kind of binary or bifurcated way of thinking about the places where we live and work and learn and live our lives is problematic. And so it in some ways kind of pits us against each other, or it creates definitions that aren't really useful. So I like to think about, for example, a continuum of between rural and urban spaces, or a lot of scholars on this are talking about the interface, the rural-urban interface, and what that looks like, that I think is really important. But what I would add to this is that rural places are also more diverse than what we see in the common narrative, even nationally. And in Mississippi, we see it especially. For example, if you look at the rural African American population, it's one of the highest in Mississippi. But when we see the narrative about rural places, right, it's as if all rural places are completely white. And it's simply not the case, whether it's here, whether it's in other states. And so, as I was saying earlier, this kind of we need to really think about the diversity of these places. And so, I really appreciate, Jake's point of what's the meaning behind saying like small town way of life. What does that mean? It means different things to different people. And if you're living in a town where there's a lot of inequality, when there's oppression and conflict and so forth, a small town way of life means something different than a place where there's more engagement, where there's public places, where there's ways where people from different racial groups and different religious groups and different political groups can come together. And so I think we have to open it up more than just geographically.
Well, I'm going to respond to what I wish you would have said, which is, read the first part of the tweet for me.
Over the past 202 years, Mississippi has experienced many triumphs and hardships, from setting the stage as the birthplace of America's music to recovering from Hurricane Katrina.
Mississippi is resilient, I think, and we always come together to make the best of our situations, I think, is how I'm going to, what I wish he would have said instead. Because, like John said, small town way of life means something different to everybody. But it's also exclusive, right? Because we also have Jackson, we have Hattiesburg, we have some micropolitan areas that are not so much small town ways of life. And I think that it kind of leaves out a section of the population. And you were saying when you see the commercials, and you see the people pictured in commercials, you also feel that exclusion as well. So, in celebration of the state's birthday, I think that a message that is welcoming and inclusive to all Mississippians, regardless of whether we live in a rural or urban areas. I'm an urban planner. So, I think it's important to set the tone for the year to come.
All right, I'm going to answer that by not answering it at all. So, I think one of the things, I told somebody recently that if I had 25 years worth of multi-million dollars to invest on behalf of the Women's Foundation, millions and millions and millions of just whatever, lots of money, I would invest in narrative change. And what I mean by that is this: whether you are a young black boy or a young white girl or whatever, depending on where you are, what you see is what you believe you might become, because that's what you're used to. And that's not necessarily good or bad, right? Like, this isn't, I don't have a judgment one way or the other on whether that's good or bad. But I do think that being able to have access to different kinds of ideas and different people from a very young age is important for every single one of us. And if you can get that in a small town, that's great. And if you can't, my goodness, let's see if we can't find ways so that we can open up the world for all of our kids, so that they can grow up believing that they might be the next governor, that they can grow up believing that they might be the next head of an organization, that they can grow up believing that they might be really happy to be a farmer and that's what they would really like to do. All of those things are valuable and wonderful, but I think the thing that many of us need, many of our kids need, is the opportunity to see the things that are out there and have opportunities, and that's what we should be looking at and working towards.
All right. Well, there's 15 minutes left and plenty of ground we have not yet covered. I'm gonna open it up now to y'all. So if you want to plunge into this big open fields, your turn.
Hi, Jake. It's
Hi there.
good to see
Good to
you
see
and
you too.
Ercilla. John, in your column of our being so attracted internationally to migrants, what is the source, the country of origin of these migrants, and are they blue-collar or white-collar workers?
So that's a great question. It actually points to the weakness of some of the data. Probably the international in-migration is higher than what we actually can document through the data. But it's a mix. So if you think about the fact that with our, especially with our universities being attractive of higher kind of trained, higher education, white collar occupations, also with changes in increasing with automotive production and so forth, you've seen the same thing. But then on the flip side, in terms of agricultural work, food processing and so forth, we've had an influx in more what we consider blue collar positions. And those were probably, we know we're undercounting in terms of the official statistics. And so I think I think to answer the question, I would say it's a mix. In terms of thinking about the value added through that, or if we want to embrace more of an international presence, which maybe not everybody agrees with, but if we think that's important, this issue of having more welcoming communities and having a more welcoming state would be valuable, but it would also be valuable for people who aren't international migrants. And so I point that out because many of the things that we can do to make our communities and our state more attractive can actually be beneficial to not only the people who live there, but also people from other states. So I don't think it's a zero-sum focus.
What are the countries or continent of origin?
It varies by sector, I would say. So, for example, you have many people coming from Mexico and also Central and South America for more of the traditional blue-collar jobs. When you look at many of the others, say, for example, in higher skilled trades and so forth, more dominance coming from Asia, for example. But I would say it's a mix for any of those, but those would be kind of the dominant threads that we would see.
While y'all think of other questions, John, it's maybe a good time to plug the 2020 census, and particularly counting our immigrant communities in the state.
Yeah. So I just took a piece of ice. Excuse me. I'm a habitual ice chewer, I have to admit. So, as was mentioned, we're involved with the 2020 census. Our state data center at the university, at Jackson State, we have a census information center. And then we have a statewide complete count committee, and then communities across the state have organized their own complete count committees. Mississippi has a lot at stake in terms of as complete a count as possible. Not just politically, the data are required, the census is required as a part of the Constitution for political apportionment, and it influences how many seats we have in the House of Representatives. It influences our voting districts and all those things, but also in terms of the access to resources that we have. And out of any state in the country, Mississippi gets more from the federal government than we put in. And for all types of programs, from education to social programs to economic development, even things that really unite us, roads and bridges and other infrastructure initiatives that we have a lot at stake. And also for our population groups, that subgroups within our population. So we haven't talked a lot about aging, is that interestingly, Mississippi is aging like the nation as a whole in the sense that we're getting older, but we're younger than the nation as a whole. But also we have high fertility rates, we have a lot of children, but we also have people who are aging. And so if you think about all the types of services and programs and infrastructure that are needed for these two ends of our population group, that the census is essential. And these data are, we do the decennial census, so every 10 years, but then that serves as the basis for our official population estimates for every year in between. And so for every person that we don't count in 2020, we're going to pay the price. We're going to have a loss every year thereafter until 2030. And the costs are actually mind-boggling. And so there's so much at stake that we need to pay attention to. And this will be the first census where a majority of people will be asked to participate online. And so we've got a lot of work to do to help people to understand the process, to be able to participate. We've got to do a lot of work of outreach to places that have traditionally had lower participation rates. How can we increase that? And it's going to have not just the financial implications, but also just how we understand ourselves. If we're having this panel a year from now, we should be able to understand ourselves even better if we have a high participation rate.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I believe someone mentioned surveys that ascertain that Mississippians want certain things. What's the want that was most mentioned or got the most?
I think I made a suggestion that we should come up with a survey to see what Mississippians who are leaving want. What would they have liked to have seen? What would have stopped them from leaving the state? It was just a suggestion.
Okay, that's one dimension and
Right.
important, but something was said about sidewalks and something else.
I do
Yeah, I
love
think we-
sidewalks, but that's what I said.
Did I say that? Okay. No, it was what I was trying to come up with, kind of like a general list of things that we all want, to describe an average Mississippian. And one of the things that most of us want are sidewalks, because I know that we live in communities where we have to walk on the street if we want to jog on the street, ride our bicycles. We don't have bike lanes, and I think that those are things that those are issues that we can get around, and that can unite us. So it was not an existing survey. I wish there was, but kind of a suggestion.
Stuart, can we fund something like that?
No, the census also sets humanities council fund.
Okay.
That's true.
I think that survey is a great idea. I love that idea. I love the idea of asking people directly. My question kind of gets into that because having been here for about 16 years and I've seen a lot of people leave and I've talked to a lot of them, this is anecdotal, not official data. But I can remember talking to one guy outside of Aladdin restaurant. We met him, he was a professor at JSU. He commutes from another state because he is not of the Christian religion. And he has been proselytized to so much that he doesn't feel safe in his home or at his doctor's office in this state. I'm not trying to start any controversy, I'm just providing this touchstone, how do you see religion playing into this idea of what is a Mississippian, and is there room for a pluralistic viewpoint, or is that, an unachievable ideal?
So I'll just throw myself. Yeah. No, I think there is room for a pluralistic Mississippi. But it begins with people, like you, who can say, hey, we all don't worship the same God. And there are places in public schools where that is respected. I know in Jackson Public Schools, for example, where a few years back there was, I think it was a prayer at convocation, teacher convocation, and it took someone to say, hey, I'm an atheist, and that's not how I get down. Peace begins, my peace begins where your peace begins. My peace ends where your peace begins, and so I think that we need to respect that religious aspect that, not everybody, sometimes it's split up. We have Jewish people, and so, and it begins with people like you know, to say, hey, you know, it's not that it's wrong,
Right, it's not.
right? It's not that it's wrong, because I think that's where we go off, on the deep end, is that we say that's wrong. And it's not that it's wrong, it's that if you're gonna do it, let's include everybody. And I think at the end of the day, one of the topics that we discussed up here a lot is inclusion, you know, to include everybody or not include everybody. Did that answer your question?
That's
It's all over the place, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I was doing a little reading for this, kind of thinking, you know, asking myself the question, like, well, who is sort of typically seen as the archetype of the average Mississippian, and sort of throwing out some characteristics. And, you know, it's somebody's white, male, rural, hunts, goes to church. You know, you can fill out the list. In this sense, I think too, like average, which sometimes can be a pejorative to call somebody average, actually shows the privilege in being seen as average, because that's the person that's prioritized. Their needs, their identity is prioritized when we're making all of these decisions, even if it's subconscious. But I was looking at sort of religion. I was looking through all of them, kind of saying, like, well, how many people actually fit these descriptions in Mississippi? And it's only 48.6% of Mississippians are male. Only 74% describe themselves as being very religious, which is still tied with Alabama for highest in the country. And I say only, but only 49% say that they go to church on a weekly basis. And so, technically speaking, by the slimmest of margins, the majority of Mississippians are not weekly churchgoers. And this is a survey too, so there's a lot of like fluff in that probably too. Hunting, so somebody who hunts. Do you know how many hunting permits Mississippi sells on an average annual basis? It's just shy of 300,000. So we're talking about 10% of the population, basically, that hunts on any given year. And some of those people are out of state, surely. And so we think about this as being an average characteristic, a defining characteristic, and actually it's pretty small. And so then you start to think about who's somebody who fits all of those characteristics, and we're only talking about a handful of people. And yet that is who is prioritized when we think about who's in our state and you know, and who we are, who is Mississippi. So we're almost right at 7. I'm gonna leave it there. If we can maybe fit in is it a quick question?
I was thinking, yeah.
A quick statement. All right, we got 2 minutes, and then we got
I think they
I like the terminology about average. What is average Mississippi? Now, I've been to all 82 counties, and I've been in Mississippi since 1974. I was 9 years old, moved from Memphis. My father saw what he said, Memphis downfall, so he moved me to the country, about an hour north of here, in that true rural area. So I could hunt and fish and be free to go and do it and feel safe. I did hunt, I did fish, I prefer the hunting more. But what is average? Well, for one thing, in this room, if you're here for this type of situation, you're not average, okay? Which is a good thing, so if you're here to learn and be a part of this, thanks to Stuart, who's an import, and other reasons, and that's good. Now, what is average? I've been all over, and there isn't an average, which is a good thing. But that word diversity that the professor likes to throw around, which is a big PC word that's abused terribly nowadays, the good thing about Mississippi, no matter wherever we go, I'm going to have a lot of commonalities.
15 seconds till we got to wrap up.
So anyway, if I go to the Delta for some soul food, I can turn right back around and go to Mama's house and get pretty much the same thing. Okay? It's just called country cooking. And whether the Delta accent may be a little different than mine, it's still Southern. So the great thing about Mississippi is we pretty much have a lot of things in common that make us one. We have our disagreements, but we don't have so much diversity or differences, say like California, that it makes us too spread out.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. In that spirit, let's all get another drink and celebrate what we have in common as Mississippi. Cheers. Happy birthday to Mississippi. Thanks to all of our panelists. Thank you. Thanks to Community Council.
May